Today we will explore one of the oldest and most fascinating professions in human history, a profession that connected kingdoms, preserved secrets, and shaped the destiny of entire nations during one of the most turbulent periods of Western civilization. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine for a moment a world without phones, without internet, without structured post offices. A world where the distance between two cities could mean weeks or even months of travel, where an urgent message could determine the outcome of a war or the fall of an empire. This was the world of the Middle Ages, a period that stretched approximately from the 5th century to the 15th century, an era in which communication depended entirely on brave men willing to face unimaginable dangers to transport words across hostile territories. Medieval messengers were not simple letter carriers. They were diplomats, spies, negotiators, and, above all, survivors in a world where every journey could be their last. To truly understand the importance of these extraordinary men, we must first transport ourselves to Europe after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. With the collapse of Rome in the 5th century, one of the most sophisticated communication systems the ancient world had ever known also disappeared. The cursus publicus, the Roman state network of messengers and relay stations, simply ceased to exist. The Roman roads, which had once been the arteries of an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, began to deteriorate. Centralized systems of government were replaced by political fragmentation that transformed Europe into a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, counties, and lordships, each with its own laws, customs, and dangers. In this scenario of fragmentation and uncertainty, the need for communication did not disappear. On the contrary, it became even more crucial. Kings needed to coordinate their military forces. Nobles needed to negotiate alliances and marriages. The Catholic Church, the only institution that maintained some form of continental unity, needed to manage its vast network of dioceses, monasteries, and parishes scattered throughout Christendom. And so, even without an organized system like that of the Romans, messengers continued to exist, adapting to the new realities of a medieval world in constant transformation. The early centuries of the Middle Ages presented monumental challenges for anyone who needed to travel. Roads, when they existed, were often little more than dirt tracks, easily turned into impassable quagmires after prolonged rains. Dense forests covered much of the European continent, serving as a refuge for bandits, outlaws, and all kinds of criminals who saw solitary travelers as easy prey. There were no reliable maps in the modern sense of the word. Travelers relied on itineraries, lists describing the towns and villages along a route, hoping to find someone at each stop who could direct them to the next destination. In this hostile environment, medieval messengers developed skills that went far beyond the simple ability to ride. They needed to be men of exceptional physical constitution, capable of enduring long journeys on horseback, often under adverse weather conditions. Endurance was fundamental, as a messenger might spend days riding without adequate rest, when the urgency of the message so required. But physical strength alone was not enough. The best messengers were also men of sharp intelligence, capable of assessing dangerous situations and making quick decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Knowledge of languages was particularly valued. Medieval Europe was a linguistic mosaic, where dialects varied significantly even within the same kingdom. A messenger traveling from London to Naples, for example, would need to be able to communicate in several languages along the way. Latin functioned as a lingua franca among educated people, especially in the context of the church, but a prudent messenger would also master local vernaculars to negotiate passage, obtain information, and, when necessary, disguise his true identity. The Catholic Church played a fundamental role in the preservation and development of communication systems during the early Middle Ages. With the Pope in Rome and bishops scattered throughout Europe, the Church required efficient means to maintain its authority and coordinate its activities. The system of papal messengers evolved from the remains of the old Roman cursus publicus, adapting to the specific needs of a religious institution that spanned the entire continent. Papal messengers transported decrees, diplomatic correspondence, and religious documents between Rome and the most distant dioceses of Christendom. Pope Gregory I, known as Gregory the Great, who occupied the throne of St. Peter between 590 and 604, was particularly instrumental in reforming the Church's communication system. In a Europe devastated by barbarian invasions and the political fragmentation that followed the Roman collapse, Gregory understood that the ability to communicate efficiently would be fundamental to preserving the Church's influence. He centralized the message dispatch system, established standardized procedures, and ensured that communication emanating from the papacy maintained consistency and authority. The messengers who served Rome traveled along established routes that connected monasteries, bishoprics, and important religious centers, ensuring a constant flow of information. The security of these messengers was a constant concern. The Church sought and often obtained guarantees of safe passage from feudal lords and secular rulers. Furthermore, severe penalties were imposed on anyone who harmed or hindered a papal messenger. This special protection reflected the recognition of the crucial role these men played in maintaining ecclesiastical order. A messenger carrying papal documents could count on the hospitality of monasteries along his route, finding in these religious institutions not only shelter and food, but also updated information on the road conditions ahead. While the Church developed its own communication system, secular powers also recognized the importance of reliable messengers. Royal courts maintained groups of official messengers, often called nuntii, who served the monarch exclusively. In medieval England, for example, there was a clear distinction between mounted messengers, who carried urgent communications, and messengers on foot, called runners, used for less urgent deliveries or for shorter distances. These royal messengers were considered part of the royal household, receiving regular wages when at court and travel expenses when on a mission. The life of a royal messenger was full of responsibilities and privileges. On the one hand, they enjoyed a relatively secure position in a highly stratified society, with access to the court and the protection of the king's name. On the other hand, their missions often took them to dangerous territories, where royal authority could be questioned or ignored. A messenger carrying the king's orders could encounter resistance from rebellious nobles or be seen as a valuable target by bandits hoping to find money or valuable information in his possession. Reliability was the most valued quality in a medieval messenger. This went far beyond the simple, timely delivery of letters. Messengers often carried oral messages, carefully memorized, which complemented or even replaced written communications. In an era when literacy was the privilege of a few, the ability to memorize and faithfully transmit an oral message was an essential skill. Furthermore, messengers were expected to be discreet. They often had access to sensitive information, state secrets, and military plans. A messenger who showed an inclination for indiscretion would quickly lose his post, and depending on the gravity of the information revealed, could lose much more than that. The conditions of medieval roads deserve special attention, as they largely determined the experience of the messengers. The Roman heritage of paved roads persisted in some regions, but centuries of neglect had transformed many of these ancient routes into deteriorating relics. Stones were often removed by local inhabitants for use in their own constructions. Vegetation encroached on the pavement, creating obstacles and hiding dangerous holes. In many areas, new dirt trails had formed parallel to the old Roman roads, simply because it was easier to follow a new path than to navigate the obstacles of the original way. Outside the areas where Roman influence was still felt, the situation was even more precarious. Most medieval roads and paths were nothing more than tracks compacted by the traffic of people and animals. These routes were highly vulnerable to weather conditions. Historical records tell us of winters in which entire routes became impassable for months, transformed into deep quagmires that swallowed horses and wagons. In the winter of 1395-1396, for example, the route between Menin and Lille, in the region that today corresponds to Belgium and northern France became completely impractical due to mud, forcing travelers to abandon the roads and cross private properties, often destroying crops in the process. Messengers developed strategies to deal with these difficulties. The choice of the riding animal, for example, was a carefully weighed decision. Horses were the preferred choice for urgent messages, offering superior speed and being associated with a higher social status. However, horses were also more expensive to maintain, requiring specific food and care. Mules, the result of crossing horses and donkeys, were particularly valued for long journeys due to their exceptional endurance. They could carry heavy loads through difficult terrain and were more economical in terms of feeding. Donkeys, native to North Africa and Arabia, were often associated with religious travelers, as riding a donkey was seen as a sign of humility, evoking the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. The cost of maintaining a messenger system was substantial, which explains why only the wealthiest organizations could afford private communication services. In addition to the animals, it was necessary to consider the costs of accommodation, food, road and bridge tolls, ferry and ship passages, and eventual bribes to officials and guards to ensure quick passage or access to important people. This high cost meant that messengers often worked on a freelance basis, accepting deliveries from multiple sources and competing with other messengers to be the first to deliver important news, which could yield additional rewards. From the 11th century onwards, with the commercial revival of Europe, merchants began to develop their own communication systems. The great commercial houses of Italian cities such as Florence, Venice, and Genoa were at the forefront of this transformation. As their businesses grew and expanded across the continent, these merchants realized they could no longer personally accompany their goods on every trip. They needed reliable information about prices in distant markets, the progress of their cargoes, the costs of tolls on different routes, and any changes in commercial conditions that could affect their profits. By the mid-13th century, the great Italian commercial houses had established their own courier services, with men and horses dedicated to traveling specific routes regularly. For about 100 years, each large commercial house maintained its own messengers, but the cost of this operation was prohibitive. In 1357, 17 Florentine companies joined together to create a shared service, the Scarsella dei Mercanti Fiorentini, the Florentine merchants' satchel. This was a significant innovation, as it not only reduced individual costs, but also established a model of postal service that could be used by anyone willing to pay, not just by the members of the participating commercial houses. The Scarsella dei Mercanti Fiorentini operated regular routes from Florence to destinations such as Barcelona and Bruges, two of the most important commercial centers of the time. The service required thousands of letters to be transported annually, keeping the messengers constantly busy. Each route had several designated messengers, with spare horses available at strategic points along the way. This relay system allowed urgent messages to travel much faster than would be possible if a single messenger had to make the entire journey. Other commercial centers quickly followed the Florentine example. In cities like Bruges, Hamburg, and London, merchant guilds established similar services, creating a commercial communication network that stretched across Western Europe. This network became so efficient that even ambassadors of European states and representatives of the Church began to request permission to use the merchants' postal services, recognizing their superiority in terms of speed and reliability. Medieval universities also developed their own messenger systems. Institutions such as the University of Paris, founded in the 12th century, attracted students from all over Europe. These young men, many still teenagers, needed to maintain contact with their families to receive funds, clothes, books, and news from home. As the banking system was not yet developed in Paris as it was in Italy, the physical transport of money was often necessary. The student nations organizational divisions within the university, based on the student's geographical origin, maintained official messengers responsible for communication with specific dioceses. The University of Paris kept detailed records of its messengers, the so-called Libri Procuratorum, procurators' books, which provide us with precious information about how this system worked. A messenger from the French nation, for example, might be responsible for the Diocese of Nevers, about 200 kilometers south of the capital. Meanwhile, a messenger from the German nation might be in charge of the Diocese of Turku in Finland, a journey that required weeks of travel. These messengers transported not only letters, but also money, packages with clothes, towels, books, parchments, medicines, and even wine sent by the students' families. University messengers enjoyed special protection, often guaranteed by royal decree. This reflected the importance attributed to universities as centers of learning and the training ground for elites. A messenger traveling under the protection of the university could expect easier passage and more favorable treatment along his route. An illustration from the Libri Procuratorum of the Picard nation, dated 1476, shows a messenger in dark travel attire, with a coat, hat, and boots, carrying a spear over his right shoulder as a means of defense. Beside him, the procurator holds a package, and a servant carries a sealed letter, illustrating the flow of communication between the university and the students' families. The letters from medieval students that have reached us reveal concerns that are surprisingly familiar to anyone who has ever had a child at university. A 12th century letter written by two brothers studying in Orléans perfectly exemplifies the combination of reassuring news and requests for money that characterized this correspondence. The brothers assure their parents that they are in good health and dedicating themselves completely to their studies, before casually mentioning that they live in excellent housing close to the schools and the market, where they can go to classes every day without getting their feet wet. The implication, evidently, is that such comfort deserves financial recognition. The French writer Eustache Deschamps, who studied at the University of Orléans before serving the King of France, composed an imaginary letter from a student to his father around 1400 that perfectly captures the spirit of these communications. The student laments not having a penny and being unable to get a loan anywhere. He complains that everything at the university is very expensive and that he cannot study his legal texts because the pages are falling out. He owes 10 crowns to the provost and finds no one willing to lend him the money. He concludes by asking for greetings and money, arguing that the student has need of many things if he wishes to progress, and that his father and relatives should supply him generously so that he is not forced to pawn his belongings. While institutions developed their formal communication systems, individual messengers continued to face the dangers inherent in medieval travel. Banditry was a constant threat, especially in forested and mountainous regions. The Alps, for example, were known for harboring gangs of criminals who attacked travelers during the summer and hid in the highest parts of the mountains during the winter. As early as the time of Charlemagne, at the end of the 8th and beginning of the 9th century, alpine passes were feared by travelers conscious of the dangers that awaited them. Medieval bandits came from diverse social backgrounds. Some were simply common criminals who saw robbing travelers as a source of income. Others were demobilized soldiers who, during the intervals between military campaigns against the Scots or the French, had no trade to return to and turned to crime. There were also impoverished knights who, having lost their lands or resources, abandoned the codes of honor that should have governed their class and became predators of the roads. The legendary Christopher the Black of Olzanica, who terrorized travelers in Silesia between 1500 and 1512, was a knight who gained notoriety for his extreme cruelty, not only robbing merchants, burghers, and other knights, but often killing his victims even after the robbery. To protect themselves against these threats, messengers developed various strategies. The most basic was simply to avoid traveling alone. Whenever possible, messengers joined merchant caravans or groups of pilgrims, seeking safety in numbers. When this was not possible, messengers transporting valuable cargo or messages of great importance could be accompanied by armed escorts, known in some regions as cottero or adventurers, mercenaries specialized in protecting travelers. Dissimulation was another common strategy. Messengers transporting sensitive information often adopted disguises, presenting themselves as pilgrims, merchants, or simply ordinary travelers. Messages could be hidden in unlikely places, sewn inside clothes, hidden in walking sticks, or inserted into secret compartments of shoes. Some messengers were instructed to memorize important messages and not carry them in writing, thus eliminating any physical evidence that could incriminate the sender or reveal the content of the communication to interceptors. The authentication of messages was a constant concern in a world where forgery could have devastating consequences. Wax seals became the standard method of authentication during the Middle Ages. Every person of importance possessed a seal matrix, often a signet ring, which produced a unique impression when pressed onto hot wax. The wax used was typically composed of about 2/3 beeswax and 1/3 resin, a mixture that produced a surface hard enough to preserve fine details, but flexible enough not to break easily during transport. The seal served multiple purposes. First, it identified the sender of the message, as each seal was unique and recognizable. Second, it guaranteed that the message had not been tampered with, as opening a sealed letter would inevitably break the seal. Third, it conferred an element of solemnity and authority to the communication. The seals of monarchs and popes were particularly elaborate, often printed on both sides of the wax and hung from the document by cords or strips of parchment. These pendant seals were more secure than seals simply applied to the surface of the document, as it was practically impossible to remove and reattach them without damaging them. The importance of seals was such that their forgery was considered a very serious crime, often punished by death. When a seal-bearer died, his seal was typically destroyed, to prevent it from falling into the hands of counterfeiters. In the case of monarchs, the ceremonial destruction of the royal Great Seal was a formal event, carried out before witnesses to ensure that no fraudulent use could be made of the instrument. In medieval Latin letters, phrases engraved on signet rings revealed the awareness of this importance. Clausa secreta tego meant, "I cover closed secrets," while frange, lege, lecta tege instructed the recipient to break the seal, read, and then hide what was read. Despite all these precautions, the forgery of messages remained a real threat. A dishonest or bribed messenger could be induced to replace one message with another, or to alter its oral content during transmission. The Canterbury Tales, by Geoffrey Chaucer, presents a literary example of how messages could be forged and the devastating consequences that could result. In the Man of Law's tale, the character Donegild forges royal letters, replacing the king's messages with others of completely different content. The messenger, though innocent of Donegild's machinations, becomes the unwitting instrument of injustice, demonstrating how the integrity of the entire communication system depended not only on seals and authentications, but on the honesty of every person involved in the chain of transmission. It is interesting to note that Geoffrey Chaucer himself, before becoming one of the greatest poets of the English language, worked as a messenger. In October 1360, the young Chaucer received 9 shillings from Lionel of Antwerp, in whose court he served, to transport letters from France to England, presumably announcing Lionel's imminent return. This episode reminds us that many notable historical figures went through life experiences that we rarely associate with their later achievements. Communication between European courts during the Middle Ages often involved much more than the simple exchange of letters. Diplomatic messengers were tasked not only with delivering messages, but with observing, reporting, and, when appropriate, negotiating on behalf of their lords. These envoys needed refined diplomatic skills, the ability to assess complex political situations, and enough discretion not to reveal information that could harm their master's interests. In some cases, messengers were instructed to gather information on the political, military, and economic conditions of the territories they visited, effectively turning them into intelligence agents. This espionage dimension of messenger activity was well known and often a cause for suspicion. Foreign messengers who stayed too long at a court or asked too many questions could be seen as spies and treated with hostility. During periods of political tension or open war, messengers could be detained, interrogated, or even executed, especially if they were captured carrying sensitive information. History is full of examples of messengers who suffered terrible consequences simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, carrying the wrong message. A particularly illustrative episode occurred in 1565, during the siege of Malta by the Ottoman Empire. When a Turkish messenger was sent to Jean de Valette, Grand Master of the Knights of St. John, to deliver a communication from Sultan Suleiman, Valette ordered the messenger to be hanged. Only when it was pointed out to him that the man was a slave who could not disobey orders did Valette change his mind, but he sent him back with the message that he would hang anyone who came to deliver future communications. Later in the same siege, when Suleiman received news that his army had failed, he flew into a rage and trampled the messenger who brought the bad news, demonstrating that killing the messenger was not just a proverb, but a very real occupational hazard. The transition to the end of the Middle Ages brought significant developments in European communication systems. The growth of cities, the expansion of international trade, and the strengthening of centralized monarchies created a demand for more regular and reliable courier services. It was in this context that one of the most remarkable stories in European postal history emerged: the rise of the Thurn and Taxis family as the masters of the imperial mail. The history of the Taxis family, as they were originally known, dates back to the small town of Bergamo, in the Lombardy region of northern Italy. Around 1290, a man named Amedeo Tasso organized his relatives into a post company, establishing what some historians consider the first modern postal service in Europe. Initially operating between Rome, Venice, and Milan, the company developed a reputation for efficiency and reliability that eventually attracted the attention of much more powerful figures. At the end of the 15th century, the wars between Guelphs and Ghibellines, the coup, factions that supported the Pope and the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, respectively, forced many family members to leave Italy and seek fortune elsewhere. This was how Ruggiero de Tassis entered the service of the imperial court of Frederick III of the House of Habsburg in 1443, almost a century after the formal end of the Guelph-Ghibelline conflict. This connection with the Habsburgs would prove decisive for the family's future. Franz von Taxis, a descendant of Ruggiero, was appointed postmaster to Emperor Maximilian I in 1489 and to King Philip I of Spain in 1504. With these appointments, Franz laid the foundations for what would become a postal monopoly spanning much of Western and Central Europe. Under his direction, a system of regular posts was established connecting the various Habsburg territories from Innsbruck to Brussels, from Vienna to Madrid. The crucial innovation introduced by Franz was the creation of relay stations where messengers could exchange tired horses for rested animals, allowing messages to travel much faster than would be possible if a single rider had to make the entire journey. In 1516, Emperor Maximilian I formalized the family's position, appointing Franz von Taxis and his descendants as hereditary imperial postmasters, granting them exclusive rights to operate postal services throughout the empire. This grant was particularly significant because it included not only the transport of official government correspondence but also the right to transport private mail for a fee. It was the birth of Europe's first public postal service. The family seized this opportunity with impressive energy. Stations were established throughout the Holy Roman Empire, where messengers could rest and exchange tired horses for fresh animals. Messengers often rode through the night to deliver the mail as quickly as possible, setting a new standard for the speed of correspondence delivery. The correspondence was transported in bags typically lined with iron, known as felleisen, which sat behind each rider on the horse, protecting the contents from the elements and theft attempts. From 1516, the Taxis postal service was extended to Brussels, meaning it spanned from Spain and Italy in the south to France, Germany, and the Netherlands in the north. Despite the turbulence of the 16th and 17th centuries, including the devastating 30 Years' War, the family maintained its control over much of the mail of Western and Central Europe. The position of imperial postmaster was made a hereditary right in 1615, able to be passed through the family's male heirs. In 1624, the family received the title of Imperial Count, elevated to imperial prince in 1695. At its peak, the Thurn and Taxis postal service, as the family came to be known from 1650 onwards, employed more than 20,000 people across Europe, including regional representatives, administrative staff, and delivery men. The efficiency of the system was remarkable by the standards of the time. An express letter sent from Paris to Brussels took only 36 hours to arrive, while standard mail from Brussels to Naples took 14 days. These delivery times represented a dramatic improvement over the months such journeys could have taken in previous centuries. The legacy of the Thurn and Taxis family extends far beyond their postal operation. The post horn, which their messengers sounded to announce their arrival in a town, became the universal symbol of postal services, still used today in postal logos around the world. The colors black and yellow, associated with the company, were adopted by various postal services as corporate identification, and some argue that the word taxi itself, used to describe hired vehicles, derives from the family name, although this etymology is disputed. As we approach the end of the Middle Ages, we can see how communication systems had evolved dramatically since the fragmentation that followed the fall of the Roman Empire. What had begun as a patchwork of individual messengers serving isolated lords had been transformed into complex, interconnected networks spanning the entire continent. The Church had maintained its own communication network, essential for managing a truly continental institution. Merchants had established services that not only served their own commercial interests, but were also available to the easy-paying public. Universities maintained links with students from distant regions, and the Thurn and Taxis family had created what was essentially Europe's first public postal service. These developments did not occur in isolation. They reflected and at the same time drove broader transformations in European society. The revival of long-distance trade required efficient communication to function. The growth of centralized monarchies depended on the ability to maintain regular contact with distant subjects. The expansion of literacy, although still limited to a minority of the population, created a demand for means of communicating in writing. And technical innovations, from better paper-making techniques to improvements in horse breeding, made more efficient communication systems possible. The history of medieval messengers also reminds us of the human qualities that made this system possible. The courage of men willing to face dangerous roads, hostile weather, and threats from bandits. The loyalty that made them keep secrets even under pressure. The physical endurance that allowed them to ride for days on end when the urgency of the message so required. The intelligence that enabled them to navigate delicate diplomatic situations or escape unexpected dangers. These qualities were as essential as the horses they rode or the seals that authenticated the messages they carried. The profession of messenger in the Middle Ages was not simply a job. It was a calling that required absolute dedication. The men who served as messengers knew that every journey could be their last. They left their families for weeks or months with no guarantee of return. They faced diseases, accidents, violence, and all the uncertainties of an era in which the forces of nature and the whims of powerful men determined everyone's fate. And yet, they continued to set out, carrying with them the words that connected a fragmented world. The pilgrims who traveled to the great shrines of Christendom, the merchants who transported silks and spices across borders, the soldiers who marched in distant campaigns, all depended on the same roads and faced many of the same dangers as the messengers. But while these other travelers could often choose when and whether to undertake their journeys, messengers served at the will of others. When a king needed to send urgent orders to a distant commander, when a merchant needed to know prices in an overseas market, when a pope needed to communicate a decision to a bishop on the other side of the continent, someone had to set out, regardless of the conditions or dangers. As the Middle Ages gave way to the modern era, communication systems continued to evolve. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century revolutionized the dissemination of written information. Maritime exploration opened new communication routes that connected Europe to distant continents. And emerging nation-states gradually took control of postal services, transforming them into government monopolies. But the foundations had been laid during the Middle Ages by men whose names have mostly been forgotten by history, but whose service made medieval civilization as we know it possible. Medieval messengers deserve to be remembered not just as historical curiosities, but as figures who played a crucial role in shaping the modern world. They were the first to demonstrate that regular and reliable communication was possible over great distances, setting precedents that would eventually lead to national postal systems, telegraph networks, radio communications, and finally, the Internet that connects billions of people today instantly. Every time we send an email or a text message, we are participating in a tradition that stretches back more than 1,000 years to those brave men who rode through muddy roads, carrying parchments sealed with wax. The history of medieval messengers is also a story about human nature and about how societies face the fundamental challenge of distance. In an era before telecommunications, the only way to make a message travel was to make a human being travel with it. This meant that all communication carried with it not just words, but also the full weight of human presence, the risk, the effort, the trust placed in an individual to complete a vital task. There was an intimacy in this system that our instant communications today can rarely capture. When we think of medieval messengers, we think of solitary figures riding through vast and often hostile landscapes. We imagine the drumming of hooves over stone bridges, the jingle of spurs in dusty inns, the sound of a post horn announcing the arrival of news from distant lands. These images connect us to a past that may seem remote, but that laid the foundations for much of what we consider normal in our daily lives. The ability to communicate across great distances is not something that simply emerged with modern technology. It is the result of centuries of development, experimentation, and refinement. Medieval messengers were the pioneers of this evolution, the first to systematically demonstrate that regular and reliable communication was possible. Their efforts deserve to be recognized and celebrated as a fundamental contribution to human civilization. Monasteries played a particularly important role in the preservation and transmission of knowledge throughout the Middle Ages, and their internal communication systems deserve special mention. Benedictine abbeys, for example, maintained correspondence networks that connected religious communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. The letters exchanged between these institutions not only dealt with administrative matters, but also served as vehicles for the dissemination of religious, philosophical, and scientific ideas. The letter books preserved in monastic archives, such as those of Lune Abbey in Germany, reveal a surprising sophistication in the art of written communication, with the nuns demonstrating a mastery of rhetorical techniques that were carefully taught to novices. Communication between female monasteries presented its own peculiarities. The nuns, often coming from noble families and therefore more educated than the average population, developed elaborate epistolary styles that combined elements of religious devotion with practical news and expressions of affection. A preserved letter from Lune Abbey demonstrates how the nuns used celestial metaphors to overcome the physical limitations of the cloister, describing how they sent saints as spiritual messengers to events they could not attend in person. Thus, as we conclude our journey through the world of medieval messengers, we are invited to reflect on the value of communication in our own lives. In an era of instant messaging and global connections, it is easy to forget how much we depend on the ability to communicate with each other. Medieval messengers remind us that this ability is not something given, but something won through the effort, dedication, and often the sacrifice of countless individuals throughout history. We hope this journey through the fascinating world of medieval messengers has been as engaging for you as it was for us to produce it. If you enjoyed this content, we invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss future historical explorations like this one. Leave your comment sharing your reflections on the topic, your questions, or suggestions for future documentaries. Each comment helps us better understand what you, our audience, want to explore, and motivates us to continue bringing stories that illuminate the past and enrich our understanding of the present. And don't forget to like this video so it can reach more people interested in history and help our channel grow. Together, we will continue this journey of discovery through the centuries, rescuing the extraordinary stories of ordinary men and women who shaped the world we live in today.